Shalom, family. It's your brother Benay Ben Israel coming to you once again with a third installment of our series, Black History, the Inquisition. That's Black History, the Inquisition. And I think with this installment, we'll try to wrap up the segment that deals with Israel being placed onto the west coast of Africa by the Inquisition and by the expulsion edicts that took place throughout Europe. And then from there, we'll kind of roll into our next series, or the hope is that we'll roll into our next series, which deals with the color of Israel. And in that series, we'll go into great detail and review lots and lots of references that deals with the color of the Jews. And we'll also explain why there are different, there appears to be two different types of Jews. You have white Jews or red Jews, as they were called, and you have black Jews, who are considered the ancient Jews. So we'll go into that and explain that in our next series. But for this series, we'll wrap up the expulsion of the Jews from Europe and the placement of the Jews onto the west coast of Africa. In this video, we're going to review 3 references. And now the point of these references is we want to provide greater detail as to what took place in Portugal and when at the time when the Jews were being taken out of Portugal and being placed onto the west coast of Africa, because I think there's a lot of good information there that you'll find interesting. So and again, hopefully these are 3 references that you haven't seen before. So let's get started. All right, so this first reference, and let me see if I can get my page number here. And so if you remember in the previous videos, for the most part, we focused on King John, because King John was the king of Portugal at the time of the expulsion edict. And that was back in the 1400s, or the 15th century. And during the time of King John, that's when Portugal took a lot of their Jews and placed them onto the west coast of Africa. All right, so on your screen here, let's see here. This is let me do this. We're on page 529. So I'm going to scroll all the way up to the top just so that you can see the title and the author. And most of these books were from the 1800s. I believe one of the references was from the 1700s, and if I can remember to point that out, I will. But we like using references that are 1800 or older. The references that have a publication date of 1800 or older, because what we found was that those references tend to have a lot of truth in them. The books that were printed in the 1900s tend to not have a lot of truth. And, we have a lot of theories as to why that is, and it has to do with Edomites controlling or taking control of the printing press in the 1900s. And we also correlate that with the time that the history in the books began to change. So anyway, that's pure theory and supposition, but just wanted to let you know that for the most part, we tend to use books with the publication dates of 1800 or older. Okay, all right. So now that that's out of the way, you should see the title and the author on your screen. So it looks like the Nautical Magazine. Again, this is from the 1800s. I'm just going to scroll down so that you can see the author as well. Okay, all right, so let's see if we can find our place again. I think we were at 529. All right, so that's 528, and then last but not least, let's go to 529. Okay, all right, so for this quote, we're going to start near the bottom. I'm going to zoom in so that you can read along with me here. And we're going to start in this paragraph. I think that's probably as far as I can zoom in. But we're going to see where it says Barbet, in this paragraph. It says, Barbet states that the reign of, you can look at that as King John II, about the close of the 15th century, it says large numbers of Jews were expelled from Portugal and taken to the coast of southern Guinea. Again, just want to point out, southern Guinea is on the west coast of Africa. So again, what we're seeing is that reference after reference confirms that the Portuguese placed large numbers of Jews on the west coast of Africa. So at this point, we can look at this as an established fact. I think at this point, we're beyond this being theory, right? This is an established fact. But let's keep going. So it says, let's start again. It says, Barbert states that in the reign of King John II, and about the close of the 15th century, right? So in the latter part, the end part of the 1400s, it says large numbers of Jews were expelled from Portugal and taken to the coast of southern Guinea, west coast of Africa. That the island of St. Thomas on the west coast of Africa, which is not more than 100 miles from the mainland, was populated by mulattoes. And here's, mulattoes, that's a term for mixed people. But we'll keep reading and we'll find out that they weren't so mixed. But it says, was populated by mulattoes, descendant from the Jewish exiles and Angola women. So here they're supposing that these black Jews were the combination of Jews and black women. So let's keep reading. It says, it is possible that the Jewish type of this character noticed in Gabon and Luango may have originated from this source. But if so, it is unknown to the present inhabitants of the country. So, in other words, when they ask the people in the country, say, "Hey, you guys mixed?" Like, no. So they didn't confirm it. So, and if it keeps reading, it says, and it would have been somewhat singular if the Roman Catholic missionaries at Luango had not detected this circumstance. So basically, they're saying that the Roman Catholics, they didn't come up to that conclusion. He said, instead of regarding them as pure African family of Jews. So the Roman Catholic looked at them as a pure African family of Jews. So again, we can look at this reference to confirm that the Jews were in fact black, and they were, in this reference, they were looked upon as a pure African family of Jews. Okay? A pure African family of Jews. All right, so that's our first reference. And again, we have three references. So if we go over to our second reference, and let me see if I can grab this page number here. So this is on page 141. 141. And I'm going to go all the way up to the top so you can see the title and the author. So let's see. This is from Princeton University, the Library of Princeton University. And let's keep scrolling down. The Critical Review of Annals of Literature. And let's see if we can see the author, all right, by the Society of Gentlemen. And let's see, there's our publication date. It is, here we go. I believe that's it. This is in the 1700s here. All right, so now that you've seen that, I'm going to see if we can find our page again. All right, again, just bear with me here while I find it. It's on page 141. I think I went a bit too far in this case. All right. This should be 141. All right. So again, I'm going to zoom in. And again, let's read about King John and the Jews on the west coast of Africa. Let's see if this provides any additional information. So I'm going to see if I can find a good place to start. And I'm going to bring it all the way up to the top of the page. So at the top of the page, you'll see where it says, Prince Henry's colonies were enlarged by his successors. So basically it's saying Prince Henry's, his colonies on the west coast of Africa, they were expanded by the kings that came after him. So then it says King John II, the king that came after him, in 1492, expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas. Again, this is in line with all the other references that we've read so far. So again, let me start again. It says King John II in 1492 expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas, which had been discovered in 1471. Then it says, now in addition, and to other Portuguese settlements. You got it? So it's saying it's King John in 1492 expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. So again, this is confirming that King John not only sent the Jews just to St. Thomas, but he sent them also to additional places on the west coast of Africa. And we found that those additional places were on the west coast of Africa. Okay? And let's read, let's see if we can read a little bit more here. It says, and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. And from these banished Jews, let me start again. And from these banished Jews, the black Portuguese. You see that? The black Portuguese, as they are called. Again, if you ever had any question about what the color of the Portuguese Jews were, this one should put that to bed, right? So let's read it again. It says, let me back up a little bit. It says, and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa, and from these banished Jews. So these banished Jews are the Portuguese Jews that were sent to the west coast of Africa. It says, from these banished Jews, the black Portuguese, as they are called, and the Jews in Luango, who are despised even by the very Negroes. So this is an interesting series of words here. It says, even by the very Negroes. So it's almost like saying they're hated by their own people, are descended. So let's read this again. It says, and the Jews in Luango, who are despised even by the very Negroes, are descended. So and there's a lot of information that's behind this statement. I'm just going to touch on it a little bit. On the west coast of Africa, not only were the descendants of the tribe of Judah or the house of Judah on the west coast of Africa, but also the other tribes of Judah, the children of Israel were on the west coast of Africa. So if you're familiar with, the children of Israel, you know that there's 12 tribes. And when you're doing your research and when you come across the word Negroes, in your mind, I want you to think the children of Israel or the 12 tribes of Israel. So whenever you see the word Negroes, think of it as the 12 tribes of Israel. And likewise, whenever you see the word Jews, you need to think of either the tribe of Judah, which is one of the 12 tribes, or you can think of the house of Judah, which was initially it consisted of 3 of the 12 tribes. However, over time, some of the northern tribes came over to be referred to as the house of Judah. So just know that Jews can refer to either the tribe of Judah or the house of Judah. And also, when you think of the word Negroes, when you see Negroes, you can think of that as the 12 tribes of Israel. So all 12 tribes. Okay. All right. So with that background, let's read that again here. I'm just going to back up here. It says, King John II in 1492 expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas, which had been discovered in 1471, and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. And from these banished Jews, the black Portuguese, as they are called, and the Jews in Luango, who are despised even by the very Negroes, are descended. Okay? And let's see here. maybe some more information here to pull out of here. It says, by these colonists, St. Thomas soon became a considerable place of trade and valuable for its sugar plantations. So we should be familiar with that word plantations, right? 30 years after their settlement, so 30 years after their settlement, no less than 100, or 30 years after their settlement, after whose settlement? After the settlement of these black Portuguese Jews. So 30 years after their settlement, no less than 156,000 robes of 30 pounds weight each of sugar were exported. So basically, after these black Portuguese Jews were shipped to the west coast of Africa, they started sending out sugar, or exporting sugar from these plantations. It says, and the engines of 60 sugar works turned by slaves. It says, these Negroes, now it's saying these Negroes. So at first, couple of sentences up, we were talking about the Jews, but now it's switching names. I don't know if you picked up on that, but it says, these Negroes were purchased in Guinea, Congo, and Mani-Congo. And the colonists had plantations furnished with from 152,000 Negro slaves. All right. So anyway, so this quote is good for pointing out that the Jews that were placed on the west coast of Africa were, in fact, one, they were Jews from Portugal. From Portugal, I just want to point that out. They were Jews from Portugal placed onto the west coast of Africa. And again, if you notice that in this reference, it also says that there was a large number of Jews. So it was a lot of them. A lot of Jews were placed on the west coast of Africa. And then it also tells you that these were black Portuguese Jews. Okay? So at this point, we should have a good picture of what they looked like and who they were. Okay? All right, so that's the second of our three references. Let's move to our third reference. Now, this reference, we're going to cover in a bit more detail. This reference, it's a good reference to point out the conditions in Portugal and I want to call it the craziness that was happening in Portugal at the time. And so for this one, let's see, we're on page 213. And again, I'm going to scroll all the way to the front of the book. Let's see if I can get you a good view of the title. All right, there we go. The Jews and the Moors in Spain. And this, again, is from in the 1800s. So let's see if we can find our page again. Let's see, 213. There we go. All right, so bear with me just for a second. I'm just going to zoom in. And there we go. All right, so get one more enhanced zoom here. There you go. All right. So on the right side of your screen, you should see the text that reads, and this is from page 213. It says nearly. Oh, let me give you just a quick background of where this reference picks up. So this reference picks up, King John of Portugal again. So most of the references that we've looked at to date deal with King John II of Portugal, and it also deals with the with the Jews coming from Spain. So the Jews were banished from Spain first. And when they were kicked out of Spain, if you're looking at a map of Spain, you'll see Portugal was on the left of Spain. So naturally, when the Jews fled out of Spain, they fled into Portugal. And what we've read before was that the king of Portugal, he let the Jews in, but he said, hey, you guys got to pay some money. They call it I forget, like a tax or something like that. He said, you guys got to pay me some money if you want to come in here. And not only that, he allowed them to come to temporarily stay there. And I believe it was for 8 months. He said, I'll let you guys come in here on your way to Africa. So basically he says, you guys can come in, but you can't stay. Okay. So this is where this quote picks up. So let's take a look at this quote. It says, nearly 150,000 souls made their way by land to Portugal, whose King John II, right, dispensed with the scruples, and I'll break this down for you, the scruples of conscience, so far as to allow his greed to triumph over his creed. So basically, it's saying when the king of Portugal saw these Jews coming in, he wanted to make some money. Basically, he said, "Okay, well, you guys can come in, but we got to do some business first, right?" So he says he granted them a passage through his dominion on their way to Africa. Did you catch that? He says he granted them a passage through his dominion on their way to Africa, and the permission of an 8-month stay in his realm. So he said, "I'll let you stay here for 8 months on your way to Africa, but then after that, you got to be gone." All right, so then it says, in consideration of a tax of $8 a head, which immense sum, so back in the day, that's saying that was a lot of money. It said, which immense sum he levied from the native Portuguese Jews. So let's pause right here just to make sure you understand what it just said. It said, so the Jews in Spain, right? Jews in Spain coming into Portugal. King of Portugal wanted to make some money. He said, "Hey, you guys, I'll let you guys come on in on your way going out. But on your way coming in, you got to pay some money. And I'm not going to tell you what, I'm not going to get money from you. I'm going to get money from your brothers here in Portugal." So basically, he taxed the Portuguese Jews for their brothers coming in. It soon gave way to the most frightful era of the exiles' suffering. All right, so after the Jews came in, what it's saying is that something bad happened. And it says, when the news reached the homeless exiles, so the Spanish Jews that came to Portugal, it says, when the news reached the homeless exiles of the atrocity or atrocious crimes inflicted upon their brethren on their way to the African coast by inhumane captains and heartless crews, seeing nothing but cruel death before them, whether going or whether remaining, they preferred meeting death in Portugal. So basically, as the Jews were from Spain came into Portugal, and some of them went to Africa, they were getting word back that some of their brothers, their brethren that were getting on those ships, they weren't making it. Some of them weren't making it to their destination. Some of them were being, most of them were being pillaged and raped, and their clothes taken from them, and they were being dumped onto the west coast, on the coast of Africa. And we've read that on some of our other references. So the Jews that hadn't got on the boat yet, they're hearing the word getting back to them about what's going on, and they're saying, "Man, if this is going to happen, I might as well just stay here and take my chances here." So this is what that's saying. It's saying that they heard all the bad things that were happening to the ones that were getting on the ship from Portugal to go to Africa, that they decided to take their chances in Portugal. So let's see. It says, let's pick it up again where it says, African coast by inhumane captains and heartless crews, seeing nothing but cruel death before them, whether going or whether remaining. They preferred meeting death in Portugal to exposing themselves to the inhumane and beastly lust and tortures of barbarous pirate sailors and African savages, and listlessly awaiting death and praying for it. They remained after the time purchased for their stay had passed away. So basically, the King of Portugal said, "I'll give you 8 months on your way to Africa. But then after that 8 months, if you're still around, I'm going to arrest you, and do some bad things to you." So the ones that hadn't got on the ships, they said, "You know what? It looks like our brethren are dying on the ships anyway. Let's just stay here in Portugal and take our chances here in Portugal." So it says, to their misfortune, it said the plague broke out in Portugal and raged with deathly fury. So, as the Portuguese were staying there, plague broke out. And what we know is that according to Deuteronomy 28, that the plague would follow the Jews, wherever they went. And that was part of the curse of the Jews from turning away from Yah's word. And as we take a look at it, just want to take a quick look here. So we look at Deuteronomy 28, and this is verse 21. So Deuteronomy 28, verse 21, just to take a quick look at the plagues, where it says, the Elohim shall make the pestilence cleave unto you, until he has consumed thee from off the land, whither thou goest to possess it. It says, the Elohim shall smite thee with a consumption, and with a fever, and with an inflammation, and with an extreme burning, and with the sword, and with blasting, and with mildew, and they shall pursue thee until thou perish. So part of the curse was that these pestilences and these plagues would follow the Jews wherever they went. And what we're seeing in this reference is, that truly did come to pass while they were sitting there in Portugal. So let's turn the page. Let's go over to, just bear with me just for a moment. I'm going to go up to the top of the next page. So it says, so when the Jews got the plague, it says, and it says, lashed the populace into a relentless fury. So the population got mad when the Jews brought this plague with them. It says, because of the visitation of the plague and the breach of contract on the part of the Jews. So the breach of the contract was the fact that those Jews decided not to get on those ships because they didn't want to die on the ships. They decided to stay in Portugal. So they considered that a breach of contract. It says the king's creed awoke again simultaneously with the awakening of his greed. So when the king got caught word of that, then the greedy king, had a new plan. So the new greedy king of Portugal, in this case King John, he came up with a new plan. He says he issued an edict which threw even that of Torquemada into the shade. So basically it says, when the greedy king heard that the Jews had breached their contract and that they were still there and that that the plague was breaking out because of them, then he came up with an even a worse edict or a worse decree than the one that was before. So this is what he came up with, and this is the reason why we wanted to bring this reference to light. So if you can pay close attention from here for sure. So look, it says all Jewish children below 14 years of age. I'm going to read this slow. It says all Jewish children below 14 years of age were torn from their parents' arms. Okay, let's think about that for a moment. All Jewish children below 14 years of age were torn from their parents' arms, dragged into the church, baptized. All right, so all the Jewish children under 14 years of age, snatched from their parents, taken to the church and baptized, right? Then it says, those under 3 years of age. So those children that were under 3 years of age were given to Christians to receive a Christian education. So I got to stop here. I have to provide just a little bit of commentary. So the babies, the toddlers and the babies. Just want to put it into perspective. The toddlers and the babies were taken from their mothers and given to the Christians to receive a Christian education. Then it says, or in other words, to be raised as slaves. You get that? It says to receive a Christian education, or in other words, to be raised as slaves. So the toddlers and the babies were taken from these black Jews in Portugal and given to foster parents to be raised as slaves and to be brought up as Christians. Then let's keep reading. It says, those between 3 and 10 years old. So now we're talking about a different age group. So we learned that the toddlers and the babies were given to Christians to be raised as slaves. Right? So we know that these are black babies. And then it says, those between 3 and 10 years of age were put on board of a ship and conveyed to the newly discovered unwholesome island of St. Thomas, called the island of perdition, or the island of punishment. All right, I got to add commentary to this as well. So between the ages of 3 and 10, so that would be preschoolers and elementary kids. So that's like taking preschoolers and elementary kids, and then so they took the preschoolers and elementary kids and put them on board of a ship and sent them to the west coast of Africa. Okay? All right. So let's keep reading. It says, which was colonized by Portuguese condemned criminals. And we understood from our previous references that these were condemned criminals from the Inquisition who were also Jews, right? And it says, was colonized by Portuguese condemned criminals to fare there as best they could. So they took the preschoolers all the way up to the elementary kids, took them away from their parents, stuck them on ships, sent them to the west coast of Africa to survive. Okay? It says, then indeed the cup of their affliction was full to the brim. Okay? And I'm just going to pause right here just to point out in Deuteronomy 28, and the reason why I keep going back and forth is because I want you to understand that this was foretold. Like this was prophesied in Deuteronomy 28, and that we shouldn't be surprised that this happened because Israel, our forefathers, broke the commandment with the Most High. And so when we go to Deuteronomy 28, verse 32, it says, thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand. Let me read that again. And there shall be no might in thy hand. What's significant about that is that if there was might in your hand, they wouldn't have been able to take them out of their hands, out of their arms, right? So if there was might in the hands and the arms of these black Jews, the Portuguese wouldn't have been able to rip those babies, those preschoolers and those toddlers, or actually the infants as well, out of their arms. And also Deuteronomy 28:41, where it says, thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. So just wanted to point out that this was foretold. This was a byproduct out of Israel breaking their promise. But the interesting thing about these references is that it gives a additional detail as far as like how this actually happened and the way it happened. So, all right. So, start where we left off. It says, those between 10. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up. I almost lost my place here. It says those between 3 and 10 years of age were put on board of a ship and conveyed to the newly discovered unwholesome island of St. Thomas, called the islands of perdition, or the islands of punishment, which was colonized by Portuguese condemned criminals and other Jews to fare there as best they could. So the preschoolers and the elementary kids weren't pushed on a boat. I mean, they weren't they weren't put on a bus. They were put on a ship, and they were sent to the west coast of Africa. Okay, so then it says those between 10 and 14 years. Yeah, those between 10 and 14 years were sold as slaves. So we just read that in Deuteronomy 28, right? So again, those between 10 and 14, again, we're still talking elementary kids. They were sold as slaves as elementary kids. It says, then indeed the cup of their affliction was full to the brim. It was a stern truth which Lanu uttered when he said, and that's German, we're going to skip that. All right, so at this point, you should understand that the Jews were placed on the west coast of Africa, and you should also understand who put the Jews on the west coast of Africa and who was there, right? So now we have a better understanding of what ages they were when they were placed there, and the conditions that was there when they were placed there. But let's keep reading because we want to get some additional understanding of how this impacted the Jews. So I'm going to go back to the bottom of the page. It says, the Jews have experienced fully the unequal skills of the church in administrating pain. Mothers cast themselves at the feet of the tyrants and pitifully begged to be taken with their babies. They were heartlessly thrust aside. Get out of here. Hundreds of mothers, mad with despair, ran behind the ships. Can you imagine that? Mothers running behind the ships as they carried off the idols of their heart and perished in the waves. So mothers were so mad with despair of losing their newborns, their babies, their elementary kids, that they ran behind the ships, jumped in the water, and swam after the ships, only to perish in the waves. It says the serene fortitude with which the exile people had borne so many. Go to the top of the page here. So many and such grievous calamities gave way at last and was replaced with the wildest paroxysms of despair. It says, piercing streaks of anguish filled the land. Childless and brokenhearted, they now sought to leave the land, but they were told that they had forfeit their right and were given the choice between baptism and slavery. So basically, because again, these were Jews that came from Spain and Portugal, when they heard that the Jews that were leaving Spain, that they were being killed, that they were being dumped on the west coast of Africa, and they chose instead to take their chances in Portugal. And then when they stayed in Portugal, King John at the time gave a edict or command to have their children taken away from them and then sent to Africa. So then after the children of these black Jews were taken away from them, then the parents looked to leave. They wanted to leave that place, but then they couldn't go. Then the Portuguese said, no, you missed your date. You missed the time to get out. So now that you're stuck here in Portugal, you got two choices. You can either be baptized into Christianity or you can go into slavery. Those were the two choices. It says, thousands, after enduring all that they did, after leaving their beloved Spain and all their wealth and ease. And I do want to point out that these Jews were wealthy when they left Spain. But here, in Portugal is where you begin to see them separated from their wealth and separated and the children were separated from their parents, which was the beginning of the Jews being separated from their history, right? So the Jews were being separated. These kids were being separated from their parents, separated from their history, and being raised to be something else. So instead of being God's people, the children of Israel, they were raised to be something else. And at this point, I do want to kind of insert I call it a supposition, or my belief here is that the so-called African American are the children that were taken away from their parents. And that's why the so-called African American, that the reason why they don't have their full history is because they were raised to be something else. So let's get back on topic. So let's see here. It says, thousands after enduring all they did, after leaving their beloved Spain and all their wealth and ease, submitted to baptism now. They said, all right, you know what? You got us whooped. You took our children. You took our babies. I'll be a Christian. I'll do it. You can baptize me. It said, in the hope of reuniting with their children. So that's why they did it. They said, look, you took my kids. I'll be a Christian. Just reunite me with my babies. Right? So let's keep reading. It says, thousands were sold as slaves. Thousands were sold as slaves. So thousands of these black Portuguese Jews were sold as slaves. Yet, prior to their being sold, they were submitted to tortures, cruelties, outrageous, too revolting, too repulsing, too heartrending to be here narrated. So this author is basically saying that before they were sold as slaves, bad things happened to them, and these bad things were so bad that he can't write them down. He doesn't want to write them down in this book. That's what he's saying. It says, terror seized upon the native Portuguese Jews. It says, when they helplessly beheld the cruelties to which their Spanish brothers were subjected. And it's interesting that it was the Spanish brethren that were subjected to these. So the children, the initial wave of children that were sent to the west coast of Africa were the Spanish Jews. So remember, they were kicked out of Spain. They came into Portugal. And then the King of Portugal said, you guys can come in on your way out to Africa. So, also want to point out the fact that the so-called African American, one of their names was Negro, which was the Spanish name for black. Did you get that? So-called African Americans were called Negro, which was the Spanish name for black. And if you ever wondered, why were you called the Spanish name for black? Well, you can begin to see it here. It was the Spanish Jews that came into Portugal, and it was the Spanish Jews, their children, that were sent to the west coast of Africa. So, now you should see all the pieces of history begin to fit back into place. Okay? All right, so let's see here. I think there's some more information here at the bottom. It goes on to say that, King John II eventually dies, and his successor, Manuel, came to the throne, ascended the throne, and that, he ended up marrying, I believe it was Isabella of Spain, and, to join their two kingdoms, so to join Portugal and Spain. And so Manuel, King Manuel, he had a heart for the Jews. So he wanted to ease some of the things that King John had done. But once he married Isabella, Isabella didn't like the Jews. So she made him continue the expulsion edict. So as you can see, I'm going to skip down here. I'm going to scroll the screen up just so that if you start at the top, it says, already he saw himself in the near future king of United Spain and Portugal and of the entire new world. It says, but Satan stepped between, dipped his pen in gall, and writing the marriage contract. So in the marriage contract, when the King of Portugal and and this Spain, I guess he was the Queen of Spain, it was in the contract, the marriage contract, that they kick these Jews out and do bad things to them. It says, demanded as one of the conditions the immediate expulsion from Portugal of all the Jews, both natives and exiles. It says the king hesitated. It said the fanatical daughter of the fanatical parents persisted. So the crazy wife was like, "You got to do this if you want to join our two kingdoms. You got to kick those Jews out." So let's see if I can fast track here. So he planned a strategy. So that, the king at the time, King Manuel at the time, he wanted to give the Jews a break, but his wife wouldn't let him. Let's see here. And let's see, he gave secret orders for the repetition of the atrocious crimes of having all the children under 14 years of age seized from their mother's bosom and father's arms. So at some point, King Manuel gave in. And so then he gave, his order. He's like, all right, we got to get this marriage done. Go and take the children from the parents. Okay. And let's see what happened. It says, and keep in mind, so these were not only the Spanish Jews, but now this included the Portuguese Jews. Okay. So he gave secret orders for the repetition of the atrocious crime of having all the children under 14 years of age seized from their mother's bosom and father's arm, dispersed through the kingdom to be baptized and brought up as Christians. The secret became known. So just make sure we understand. It says, according to this, it says that the Jews that were left in Portugal, they were commanded to take all the children and then send them to the Christian families in Portugal to be raised as Christians. It says, fanatical mothers threw their children into deep wells or rivers. And it reads, mothers were known to take their babies from their breasts and tear them limb from limb, rather than to resign them to Christians. They would rather know the bodies of their children in the graves and their released spirit in heaven than have them adopt a faith into which Satan sent his friends for their... Let me read that again. All right, and keep in mind that this version of Christianity that these Jews are fighting so passionately against is the Roman version of Christianity. Just want to put that out there. Because it's a twisted version of Christianity. So let's read it here. It says, mothers were known to take their babies from their breasts and tear them limb from limb, rather than to resign them to Christians. They would rather know the bodies of their children in the grave and their released spirit in heaven than have them adopt a faith into which Satan sent his friends or their schooling. With all the parents' opposition, the king's order was executed. Many accepted baptism, but not enough to please the king, and to wreak vengeance upon them for thwarting his wishes, he revoked his edict, seized all who had not yet fled, and sold them as slaves. Okay? So that's the end of the third reference. And again, the point of this reference is to give you an idea of what actually happened in Portugal. And this is a good reference to show you the state of affairs in Portugal as the Jews were sent to the west coast of Africa. So just to kind of review what we've learned through these references. So we learned that the Jews were referred to as Portuguese Jews, or black Portuguese Jews. We learned that the Jews that came into Portugal were Spanish Jews, right? Because they came from Spain. And the king of Portugal, he gave them temporary residency. He said, you guys can stay here for 8 months on your way to Africa. And that we learned that for the Jews that made it to Africa, he said that they were being plundered of their goods, that they were being stripped of their clothes and valuables, and that they were being dumped on the west coast of Africa. And that the Spanish Jews that hadn't gone yet, that once they caught wind of what was happening, that they decided to take their chances in Portugal. And that when they decided to stay in Portugal, that's when things went from bad to worse, right? So that's when the king had issued an edict to take the children, from between the ages of 14 years or younger. So the references that we read today talked about the children from 14 years or younger, but we have additional references that shows that he later increased that to include the children, the Jewish children from the ages of the 20s and younger. So it was a lot of children that were taken from their parents in Portugal. These Spanish Jews that were in Portugal, and the Portuguese sent them to the west coast of Africa. And which is why, again, these were Spanish Jews, which is why the so-called African Americans were called Negroes, the Spanish word for black. And we read that they were black Portuguese, right? So, but the twist here is that they're actually the Spanish Jews. So that's why they used the Spanish word for black instead of the Portuguese word for black. So, all right. So now that we've had that, so we'll finish this series here with this last reference, and then what we'll do is that for the next series of videos, we'll move into the color of the Jews, and we'll attempt to explain why today there are two classes of Jews. Why there's black Jews, which are considered the ancient Jews, and why there are red Jews or white Jews, and where they come from. We have to provide some history on that so that you can understand why you have the two sects and where they come from. So we'll look for that, and then from there we'll move into Esau. That's a very important topic for for so-called African Americans, is the history of Esau, the history of Edom, and that goes into the Ashkenazi Jews and some other interesting facts that you really need to know. So again, thanks for watching. If you can, take the time to go ahead and subscribe, and just so that you can get notified of when new videos come out. And have a blessed day, and shalom.